Oh, okay. Do you normally work with veterans? So I know, or is it pretty much anyone?
I work with both veterans and non-veterans. My husband is a veteran, and so is my brother-in-law. So I think I learned their language a little bit, got to know their culture, had a taste of what it's like for them and their barriers to treatment and the struggles that they have around PTSD and just basically the injuries that come from being in the military for some of them, as well as the really positive impacts that it has on their lives and what it's like to transition from
Yeah,
military.
yeah.
Right.
So let's talk. I'm cutting you off because all the conversations always happen better before we start, and then I say do it again. But that'll be
Okay.
good. We have a lot of military people that listen to this. I've
Okay.
worked at the military. I'm not a military person. I've worked in another place and still may,
Okay.
and deal with a lot of those people. So the last episode that we did was actually with the Delta Force operator, who's a friend of mine, and he lived at my house for 3 months. We talked about the transition. He hunts human traffickers now, which probably a sad thing for them because he usually finds people. But
That's good.
we have a lot of people from the military who do listen and deal with that sort of stuff, so we can talk about that.
Okay.
Um, yeah, is there anything that's off limits? Just so I know, because I generally don't edit our podcasts.
Don't think so.
No.
Yeah. Although I can't
Okay.
say there's confidentiality involved, so I can't give any major
Yeah,
descriptors of
yeah.
people or anything like that,
Names.
but that would probably not happen anyway. Yeah.
No, I'm not going to ask. I don't even know the people in general. So
Yeah.
cool. All right, here we go. Allison, thanks for joining today.
Yeah. You bet. It was really cool to be asked. I'm happy to be here.
Well, my first question for you is what makes horses so magical?
Um, Great question. I think every website for equine therapy has a page that says why horses, so everybody wants to understand it. I would say that I can give you the short answer, which is that they are prey animals, which makes them incredibly sensitive. So 1,000 times more sensitive than we are in terms of what we pick up on. So think about how sensitive we can be to someone's vibe, to their mood. We can probably tell, especially if we're close to somebody, what's going on with them. Take that and then multiply it by 1,000. And you've got the sensitivity of horses to our emotional states, our nervous system states, our biological markers, how we're showing up, basically. They're aware with that. We're like, they're just going to take it all in and really be aware of it. And the other piece is that they're herd animals, which makes them sensitive to relationship. And relationship is the source of their safety in the wild, not so much in domestication. But their evolutionary process was supported by them being able to trust each other and support each other in a herd. So they need and are looking for people who are, or other beings who are trustworthy, honest, upfront, calm, and regulated. And when we don't show up that way, or any other being doesn't show up that way, they they make attempts through their body language. They communicate what they're feeling when they're in your presence and you're not someone that they can trust yet. So they might walk away. They might show you what it feels like to be around you. So they might get agitated, or they might like look around for things on the ground, or they might roll, or whatever. We have unique individuals in our therapy herd, so they all do different things. But the horses will show us, which is why I think a lot of people talk about horses as mirrors. And I would say that yes, they are mirrors in the sense that they're showing us something, they're showing us who we are, but they're also communicating from their own individual place of what it's like for us to be with them. And then when we shift and when we regulate, when we show up differently, when we check in and become aware of what's going on, and we come into a state of what's called congruence, which means that, I mean, the short story is the inside matches the outside, that we've owned what we're bringing in. We don't have to change what we're bringing in. We just have to own it, meaning we have to be aware of it and we have to be able to name it. That as soon as we do that, that calms everybody down. And the analogy to that is like if you're at home and your partner's had a bad day and you're like, what's going on? And they're like, I'm fine. And you know that they're not. And it's just like anxiety producing until they say, I had a really bad day and tell you what was going on and I just need support or whatever it is, that usually calms us down as humans. Well, take that to the next level, that 1,000 times stronger for the horses. They're going to show us, they're going to regulate with us. So the behavior changes almost right away. So why that's so magical is that it gives people the opportunity to learn how they show up, what's going on inside of them that is maybe blocking them in their lives outside of the barn, and how they can shift it and what the positive impact is on relationship. And relationship, as we know, is the source of happiness and health and peace of mind in our lives. And when that's not going well, we tend to really struggle. So the horses have an opportunity to teach us how to be better in relationships by showing us what they need in order to feel safe.
Who figured this out about horses?
Great question. Probably it's been a process. A lot of people have contributed. Where equine therapy came from was in the 90s, after about 30 years of what's called therapeutic riding now, which is basically using horses to help with physical disabilities. So people with spinal injuries, brain injuries, since the 1960s, they've been able to use horses as a way to fix their spines and help their posture and give them this kind of like different physical approach. So it's like physical therapy. The motion of the horse is really good for pelvic injuries and for other things that have to do with our core. So what they noticed, the folks who were doing all the physical therapy with horses at that time, noticed that there was also this incredibly positive social and emotional impact. And they started going, wait a minute. What if we just did that? What if we just focused on that? What if we brought in people who needed that social and emotional support instead of just the folks who were showing up for the physical aspect? And let's see what happens. So that was sort of the beginning of equine therapy in the 90s. And over time it developed, and probably the most important contributor to the science of why horses and why they're so magical is the HeartMath Institute, who did a study that showed that our heart rate variability matches up with the horse's heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is a measure of stress. The more variability there is, the more stressed we are, basically. And horses tend to have a very coherent heart rate variability, meaning it's very low. So they exist, think about being in the wild. You can't show up on anybody's radar. So they're basically on like low key all the time until they have to be in high key to run away from a lion or whatever. So they're going to be in low key and really low variability, whereas we tend to be incoherent. We tend to be in this incoherent, really high variability state. And then when we are around horses, their huge hearts that have a huge electromagnetic field brings us into a state of coherence, which is why so many people feel calm and feel a lot more like aware and present around horses. So that was probably the biggest contributor to say there's actual science behind the fact that these big creatures with big hearts, no frontal cortexes, are showing up and actually regulating our bodies and making us more here, more human in that moment. And then there's been lots of other people who've contributed to the language around it. But I would say that most of us come up with our own observations based on what we see, and we land somewhere into what I described. You know, the sensitivity of horses is very well documented in the science. So that's there. There's been a lot of ethological studies that have been done on their brains, their eyes, their ears, whether they see color or not, that have helped us to explain how sensitive they are. And then we also watch. We can see what happens. So a lot of it's pretty anecdotal at this point. It's really hard to do science with horses because they are a variable. They're individuals. So it's hard to say, like, not all horses are going to act the same in all situations. So it's really hard to isolate what it is about the horses specifically. If you think about like scientific studies, they want to isolate, like it was the pill or it was, you know, the intervention. And the intervention here is the horse, but like, which horse? And in what conditions? And with what person? And so much of what goes on we can't measure with horses because they're whole beings. So it's really just the horse has become what it is. And yeah, they all show up in this way that's really important and special. And working in a herd is really cool because you get everybody's input. And by everybody, I mean all the different horses. So that's where we're at. Hopefully the studies will continue and be able to really find what it is. But I kind of hope we don't. I hope it just stays magical.
What did you say about their frontal cortex? They have one or don't have one?
Oh, they don't have one. Whereas we obviously have a huge active one. So how that influences their behavior is that they don't judge. Their reaction times are something like 10,000 times faster than ours. So they're just going to express. They're just going to like respond. All of their brain is 100%, not 100%, but mostly sensory. So they're taking in sensory information and then acting accordingly. Whereas all of our sensory information goes through our frontal cortex. So we always think about it, or we judge it, or we just make decisions about it, whereas they don't. So how that translates into human language is that their behavior is very authentic. They don't trim or curate or make decisions or like keep it in. If they're feeling something, they're showing it. And that's really great because we tend to not be authentic. We find a whole bunch of ways as humans to strategize around how to get what we need in social interactions, and we limit our authenticity if we feel like that's not going to get us what we want. So when they show up and they're just like completely authentic, they show up as very trustworthy for us too, because then we can trust that they're always telling us the truth. They're never lying, they're never pretending, they're never doing anything. So people who really struggle with human therapists because they don't trust them, I've had lots of clients who are like, well, I'm paying you, so you have to say that if I express care, right? If I say like, well, I care about you or I'm here for you, they'll be like, well, you have to because I'm paying you, whatever, $150 an hour. And so there's always going to be that lack of trust with humans with certain types of clients, and not all of them, but with certain types. And so with the horses, it's like horses aren't getting paid. Horses have no reason, no stake whatsoever in how they show up. And so when they're just this authentic being without the frontal cortex, then we can really trust them. So most of the clients who struggle with human therapists trust horses implicitly. They just feel that trust. They feel that they can trust horses to give them the truth in a way that feels good.
They're not scared because the horse is so big.
Oh, some people are, yeah. So the other thing that was why are horses so
I mean,
magical?
being in, yeah. I mean, I'll say this: like, I grew up on a farm.
Mhm.
I had horses. I grew up riding a Shetland pony, um, which isn't a horse, but around horses, and being
Yeah.
friends who used to come over, and I'd say, "Hey, jump the fence and come into the field." Start to get scared because they, these animals are big,
Yeah.
and they do react, and maybe that's because maybe I was experiencing that because they were scared, right? But that's why I asked that question, because they are, horses especially are very big, and we have a horse. They're big. I mean, and they get bigger as you get closer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they're huge. I own a Clydesdale who is 18 hands, and he is a gentle giant, but man, people stand beside him like he's taller than I am at his shoulder. And they're like, wow, he's big, right? And the closer that they get. So um, a lot of people land in one of two
Just to
categories.
interrupt you, I'm interrupting you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interrupting you for purpose for listeners. They won't know what 18 hands is.
Oh,
So how
18.
big is that? Tall.
So a hand is 4 inches, so 18 times four. What is that? It's like over 6 feet. So he's a tall horse at his shoulder. So when he's got his head up, it's even bigger. His head is the size of my torso, so I'm like 5'4", not a very big human, but his skull is the same length as the space between the top of my head and my pelvis. And his shoulder is huge. Like just his actual shoulder blade is probably bigger than most of my upper body. So he's a big, big guy. And luckily, Clydesdales that are a draft breed, they were the tractors and the agricultural machinery of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. They were bred to be gentle, because imagine a really hot, spicy personality on a big horse like that. So they are notoriously calm. They're known as cold-blooded, but they still are huge. There's thoroughbreds that are huge and long legs. They're just big. Their chests are huge. And so we make a point of having the starter pack, which is like our dwarf goats, and then we move on to mini horses, and then we move on to ponies, and then we have small horses, medium horses, and large horses. So we really give people a chance to adjust. But some people love the big ones, especially, this is going to go into technical clinical stuff, but what I've noticed is there's a pattern where, depending on what the person's attachment needs are, so what that refers to just in a very short way is like, where's my wounding around connection? Did I get it? Did I not get it? Did I get too much of it in the wrong way? Did I get nothing at all? Am I forced to be super independent? Am I someone who learned how to control in order to get the relationships that I needed? Or am I someone who feels really stuck and hopeless and invisible? And those are all like very brutally horrible summaries of what attachment wounds might be, but they lie in our nervous systems. And so the folks who are big into control, so people who are really got their shit together, take care of themselves, show up really well put together, they tend to struggle with the size of horses because they feel out of control around them, because they can't predict the movement of an 1,800-pound animal. And what if it swings my head? Or what if I like, what if? So their brains go to that place. So the bigness can be really a great place to start with those folks, because it shows up right away. What do you do if you're not in control? How do you want to navigate? How do you want to keep yourself safe? And then there's folks who have that really like young part that want touch and want closeness and really like the size of the horses because it feels like a big presence to them that's comforting, and they'll move right towards them and they'll lean on them and they'll hug them and they'll want to ride them. So most people will fall between those two extremes, and they tend to cluster depending on what they're showing up with their attachment needs. So that's what's kind of cool as an assessment tool. Like, what happens right off the bat when you step into a space with horses? What happens when you're even just watching them from behind a fence? So just the idea of being around horses is where the therapy starts, which is really cool, because then it's begun and people get a lot of value out of it. It doesn't take like 5 sessions to get there.
Yeah,
It takes 5 minutes.
Wow. I interrupted you. You said something about why the horses are so magical. Do you remember that? No. We'll come back around to it, I'm sure. What about their ears? I'm curious about their ears and eyes. Can they see color? I never really knew that.
Yeah, they can see a muted version of what we can see. So we have our primary colors, the blue, the red, and the yellow. They can see very pastels. So they can see light blue, light yellow, and a pink, basically. They're tuned towards green, like most animals are, so they can they can do that. But eyesight is so different for horses because they have that herd biology with the eyes on the side of the head, and they have panorama, so they can see 340 degrees. Little space in front of them they can't see, and a little space behind them. So their eyes are mostly there to scan the environment and to detect motion, especially fast, quick motion. But their ears and their skin and their sense of smell are probably the most important when it comes to detecting any kind of predator. So the whole system works together, and their ears kind of have this rotational thing where they can, satellite dish them in whatever direction. So the ears are probably the most expressive part of them, which is really cool. And if you've been around a horse, which you have spent a lot of time, you're trained or you're taught to look for when their ears are pinned, which is a sign of anger. Like they're pinning their ear. I mean, we interpret that as anger. It's a sign of like wanting to move another horse, aggression, pain, potentially. So like a negative expression is the ears pinned. But they can put their ears all the way back and listen to what's going on. Basically, if you want to know what a horse is paying attention to, look at their ears and not so much their eyes. Because like you can't, with panoramic pupils, you can't make eye contact. So like you can look into a horse's eye, but like he's looking at you plus everything else, plus the trees, plus the mountains, plus everything up to a mile away. So if you really want to know what a horse is paying attention to, you look at their ear. And if you're breathing or you're grooming or you're somewhere behind them, they're always going to have one ear on you, just like checking in and seeing where you're at. Well, they might turn their head and kind of lean it in a little bit. So it's pretty cool. Their whole system is just made for, grazing and for like, while they've got their head down with their lips and their mouth and their tongue and their teeth, looking for little shoots that are tasty, to also have their eyes and their ears open to like wolves or coyotes or whatever might be showing up in the periphery. So they're an incredible animal for what they can do while they're just eating, because that's their main job. Did I answer your question?
Oh, they're oh yeah, you did. But they can see a mile away.
Mm-hmm. Movement. They're mostly scanning for movement, and they can see movement up to a mile away. Which is why when there's a plastic bag blowing through the wind, the next farm over, everybody's paying attention to it.
Spook.
Yeah, they might spook if it's like sudden. If it's a windy day, they really struggle because everything's moving. So, and their brains aren't good at distinguishing between, like they don't think about it. They're a run now or react now, think later kind of animal. Whereas our brains are designed to go, oh, that's just a plastic bag, right? Like we might note it, but then it goes through that frontal cortex that goes, nope, you don't have to worry about it. Whereas horses are like, holy shit, what is that? And then they look at it and they go, I still don't know what that is, but it's not running towards me. And then it might take them a minute. You've probably seen it. Like they snort, they back up, they get really upset about it. And they only calm down when you bring the bag over to them and let them sniff it and you put it on their bodies if they let you. And then they're like, okay, that's not going to hurt me. But there's no part of their brain that's like, oh, that's a plastic bag. Don't worry about it. So that's maybe the dark side or the other side of the coin of their sensitivity, is that they tend to react very quickly to stimuli that are movement based that they don't understand. So lots.
Can they remember that?
Their memories are mostly associative.
like the bag.
Yeah, they would get used to it. So like their brains are so different. Their memories are associative. So if there's always a plastic bag blowing and it never hurts them, then they do what's called, like, they basically desensitize to it. But their brains are not like, that's a plastic bag, it can't hurt me, right? It's going to be like, there's that thing blowing in the wind and it hasn't hurt me the last 5 times, so it's probably not going to hurt me this time. But it's like, it has to be patterned and it has to be in the similar conditions and it has to be in the same place. So they see everything in context. They don't take the plastic bag out and go, a plastic bag in this scenario is going to be the same as a plastic bag in another scenario. So it might be okay with plastic bags at home, but then take me somewhere on a trail and there's a plastic bag and I can't go, oh, it's a plastic bag, it's fine. Instead, they're like, this is a whole new context and I might not be safe this time. So it's like, imagine they're living in the painting. And if you can't take one element out of the painting, it's the whole painting that they remember and that they learn from, which is why relationship is so important. So it's like, how we show up regularly is what is important. When you're working with your own horses outside of the context of therapy, the most important thing you can do is be consistent. It's like parenting, but it's like, I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to show up and we're always going to be calm and do the same thing together. And we're going to hang out and I'm always going to ask you the same thing in the same way. And I'm going to be fair about it. And I'm not one day going to show up and all of a sudden randomly ask you to do something I've never asked you to do without preparing you for it. So I'm fair and consistent and compassionate and quiet. That is what over time creates the relationship for them. So you can't like connect with a horse once and then you're in. It has to be like multiple experiences of you being the same. And that's what's so great for the therapy clients, because if they come for multiple sessions and they work with the same horse, then that horse starts to associate them with like, I'm going to get groomed. I'm going to be like, I'm going to get loved on. We're going to go for a walk and I'm going to get to eat grass and you're going to work on being calm with me. And I love that. So then they're going to walk up to you. So it's like, it develops that relationship over time because they associate you with specific feelings. How you feel to them is the most important thing. And they get an idea of that over time.
And that's how they remember you?
Yeah, that's how they remember.
Do they remember by smell?
Yep, they remember by the whole being. The whole shebang is what they take in. How you feel, how you smell.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because they can't associate, or they don't have the ability to understand an individual. They don't have a concept necessarily of an individual, more of a concept of a short story movie.
Yeah. Yeah, like an experience. You are part of an experience. Mm-hmm. So, that's why we try to manage the conditions under which we work with horses. Like we try not to do it when it's windy because they're going to be already like upset. We try to make sure that they're not, covered in bugs or they're in pain or any of those things. Because if I show up and they're in some kind of physical discomfort, then I'm going to be the one who's associated with the physical discomfort in some way, whether I'm alleviating it or whether I'm just there when it's happening. So all of that is really important. Yeah, it's like it's a whole, which is cool. I mean, that's one of the things that is different about equine therapy from traditional office therapy is that it's holistic. It's the entire experience of ourselves, not just our thinking or our thoughts, not just our emotions, not just, events that happened to us in our past or our trauma. It's like everything. It's the whole being is what the horses are responding to. And that's generally a lot more helpful for people who are treatment resistant or who struggle with talk therapy. So like veterans, for example, not big fans of talk therapy. And they know how to like do a lot of things and compartmentalize in ways that is very functional for someone in the military. But it isn't so functional when you're trying to like be married, raise kids, show up, make a transition. So, so it's like they get to be seen in their wholeness, and don't have to talk about it, which is probably the main thing I've learned about veterans, is that talking about stuff is hard. And not just because they might not have the words for it, but because they don't know if it's going to be okay. Letting their guard down might not be safe. They don't know who's listening. They don't know who might be writing it in a file. But also it would mean admitting it to themselves. And that can be really hard when you've done a lot of work to put your shit in a box and forget about it. So, but the horses see it, feel it all, and there's no hiding from them, unfortunately. And fortunately. It's usually by the time someone's showing up, they want to be seen.
How did you
do it?
How did you get involved with this? What drew you to this? Because you have a psychology background, and you somehow transitioned into horses.
Yeah, great question. Well, I was born in 1978. How I showed up is probably a much longer story, but I can give you the short version, which is I struggled with a lot of trauma in my childhood. I grew up in a dysfunctional family, a lot of places where I wasn't allowed to have emotions or speak my mind, that kind of stuff. And then I developed an eating disorder when I was 12 that lasted for about 10 years. And eating disorder recovery is notoriously one of the lowest when it comes to high percentages of how people recover. It has a high mortality rate. It's treatment resistant, terrifically treatment resistant. And I did a lot of therapy that was talk therapy. And when I look back on it now, the therapist that I had when I was a teenager, starting about the age of 15, she was incredibly kind. She was very sweet, very compassionate, but I didn't have access to any of the stuff that I needed to be able to process, to be able to recover. So therapy didn't help me recover. Unfortunately, it gave me a place to go and talk about my struggles, but it didn't contribute anything to my recovery. It wasn't until I was in my 20s, I graduated from college, and I discovered, well, the universe brought me this person who had healed himself using ancient Chinese medicine and Qigong from a motorcycle accident where his spine had been severed. And he was riding a bike, and he had basically fully recovered from this injury when doctors had told him he wasn't going to be able to. And he told me a little bit about his Qigong group and what was going on. And I joined it. And in that 5-year period, I learned a lot about the role of emotions, energy, what it means to be able to feel in our bodies. And if you know anything about eating disorders, one of the main things is it's high dissociative. So you're not in your body, which means you spend a lot of time in your head. The trauma that you've experienced basically teaches you to be out of your body. So I learned how to come back into my body, and there's a lot of information there. I'd ridden horses and been around horses my entire life from the time I was 4. One of my earliest memories was sitting on a horse with my dad. And I rode horses up until the time I was 15 or 16 pretty regularly, and I loved it. So somehow, I taught high school for a few years. It was really clear it was not the right fit for me. I had a whole lot of illnesses and struggles and things that were really clear that it was just stressing me out too much. So I took a year off, and I went and did a month of intensive therapy with a woman who had studied at Europa University, which is here in Boulder. And she had worked with Dewey Freeman, who is one of the main trainers of equine therapy. And in this month of intense therapy that we did together, she, led me through a series of experiences. She was very experiential, which I really liked. So it wasn't like talking about stuff. It was doing experiences that helped me to get in touch with what was going on. And what kept coming up was horses. And I was like, weird. It was just this thing. I would have dreams about horses. It would come up on these lists of things that I would do that I was drawn to. And after that month time, I went back home. She was in Florida. I lived in Canada at the time. I was back home in Canada and feeling like really just buried by my life again. And she said, hey, I think this is the thing. You might want to look into this. Just curious. She sent me a link to the Gestalt Equine Institute of the Rockies that Dewey was running. And I clicked on it. And as soon as the website showed up, I was like, oh my God, this is it. This is the thing. And I just felt like I needed to go. And when I got there, it was so clear that it was exactly where I was headed. So my values that came out through my work included like being outside, really honoring the natural world as a part of us rather than something that we can do things to, that we need to connect with and be part of the natural world in order to find our own healing and in order to find our own peace. And that the best way for me to do that was to work with people on deep personal change rather than trying to change a system. I mean, if you've ever tried to change a system, like, doesn't work. And good systems, bad systems, right? There's nothing about that, but that there's a huge amount of power in an individual finding deep transformation, which I had experienced in my life. And every time that I did deep healing in my own life, I always had a very positive impact on the people around me. Every time I made a shift, someone in my family would make a shift. Every time that I would like really deepen into something, then all my relationships would change. So I was aware that I'm like, okay, well, let's do it one person at a time. So therapy outside, and then with horses, check the box of holistic. This is nervous system, relationship, body based. Like there's sessions where we don't do a lot of talking. The horses are just doing their thing on someone's nervous system. People are getting into their bodies and finding something there. And that was like pretty much what I experienced in my Qigong studies, was like the power of getting into your body and moving energy was essential to a mental and emotional healing, not just physical healing. So that all came together, and it was just so clear this was made for the places that I had come from and made sense of my life, and the struggles that I'd been through. And it brought these beautiful animals back in to my life, and they had been a source of comfort and fun and safety and escape for me when I was a kid. So transitioned really well. And I worked a lot with teens at first, which was great because then all my high school experience came in handy. I could connect with teens. I was a horrible teacher, but I was great connecting with them. So I was able to use those skills. And it's just kind of gone on from there. So, and I moved from Canada. I met a wonderful man from Michigan. We got married, my husband, who's the veteran. And yeah, history is being written as we speak.
So do you think that psychologists become psychologists to really heal themselves?
My experience in the therapy world is that therapists, I'm talking about therapists because I don't know a lot about psychologists, slightly
Sure.
different path, but in terms of like the counseling therapy side of things, I have my own experience. So I
Mhm.
fall into one category, which is that I became the therapist that I needed. So that's one. And then for other people, they have just a deep desire to help, and that's part of their personality. And supporting people feels really good to them, and they love helping people to grow. And this is a Venn diagram, so everything kind of overlaps. And then another category, there's like a high percentage of people who experienced parents or people in their family, siblings, who struggled a lot with mental health, and they are drawn to becoming a therapist to help people like the people in their family. So it kind of covers up like that. But what happens inevitably is that being a therapist or a counselor requires you to continue to do your own healing. You cannot be an effective therapist, especially an equine therapist, because the horses are there with you too. So you have to be grounded and regulated and available and congruent in order to run a safe session. And if you're not, for whatever reason, which all of us go through these phases where we're not, then the horses are going to show you, and you're not going to provide effective services in the same way. And it may not be noticeable to the clients, it may not be noticeable to anybody else, but we feel it. So all of the folks that I work with have to be committed to taking care of themselves physically, emotionally, and mentally in order to show up to do equine work. Forget about that. All of the folks that I know who are also counselors in a traditional sense, they have to have their own therapist. They have to work through all the stuff that's coming up with their clients, but also just they have to be able to keep themselves present and grounded, because the world that we live in requires therapy, because the community doesn't know really how to hold people who have the trauma or the wounding that can show up. And so we're being asked this huge task, which is, you need to be the healing relationship for someone who has been damaged in relationships. And you also have to be willing to tolerate their emotions, their dysregulation, their struggles, and all the times that they are either going to push you away or pull you towards them too close or whatever it is. You have to be the most adult and the most regulated person in that room all the time, which is why most therapists can't do more than 20 hours of therapy a week. And if they do, holy crap, good for you. But it's exhausting. So it's one of those things where it's like, even if you go in because you want to serve, or even if you go in because you want to be someone who, you could have helped someone in your family, inevitably your healing is always the first thing that's going to show up. That as you heal and show up more, the more you're able to support your clients. So yeah, the long answer to that is it's inevitable, because there's always going to be another individual who shows up who's going to challenge your limits of what you can handle and what you can hold. And if you're not doing that work, then you're just not able to provide them with the services that they need.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I got a master's in psychology with a concentration in counseling because I think it would be cheaper in the long run to become the therapist that you need than find the therapist that you need, which can be very hard.
Yes.
So it was a loaded question, but I was curious what you thought. So how does equine therapy, we've talked about it. We talked about how you got here. Well, I guess I am curious. So did you have a resolution with your, I hesitate to call it disorder, but challenge?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Through equine therapy, or?
I mean, it's always ongoing. I would definitely consider myself recovered. I haven't had any of the symptoms or behaviors for 25 years at this point. So like that's not part of my world. I would say that Qigong was probably the thing that got me through that. And it got me to a space where I was then open to what the horses, and I could understand what the horses were offering, because I don't think it's obvious. Most people ask the question, like, what is it about horses? Because they basically are like livestock, like standing around in their own poop, and they don't have a whole lot of intelligence, and they're really different from dogs, which is what we usually associate when we think of pets or cats. So it's not always clear what the horses offer. And I needed to do all of that work of embodiment and being really clear about like being so perceptive and able to track what the energy was in the system so that I could see what the horses were actually doing. So by that time, I did a chunk of work with horses. I quit my job. I moved from Canada, drove back and forth every 90 days in order to make sure I wasn't violating anything. I have my green card now, so nobody's listening, hopefully. But it was like I lived on a ranch and I managed barns and I spent a lot of time with horses, and they like worked their magic on me. I kind of facilitated my own equine therapy sessions with them and learned even more. So it deepened my relational healing, and it still does. I mean, I had an experience last week with my horse, with the big guy, where I showed up in a specific way, and he was showing me that it wasn't feeling good, and I like went inside and shifted and found a space inside me. I'm like, oof, that's an interesting spot, and moved the energy in my body. And then he like took a big breath, went, and then walked up to me. So it was like, there's another layer of my own growth. So it's always happening. But I would say that like the Qigong that I did and the groups that I did around that probably resolved the heavy eating disorder behaviors and symptoms. The wounding is always there and it's always going to show up, but I don't have to act it out anymore. Thank God. And horses didn't have a huge role in that, but they ended up later.
Well, can equine therapy fix that though? Or do some of your people that come to see you have to go through a process of what you went through?
It really depends on the individual. Most folks, so right now they've changed the diagnosis coding and everything around eating disorders. There's, eating disorders that we know, anorexia and bulimia. And then there's like eating disorders, not otherwise specified, EDNOS, which is like a combination of those two, or can include binge eating, or orthorexia, or, over exercising. So those things have all been mixed into it, but they still use weight and they use other things, to measure whether someone qualifies for that treatment. So I probably work more with what's called disordered eating, which is on a spectrum less health risky of those behaviors. So I make a point of saying I'm not going to work with someone who is severely underweight, or who is, whose weight is impacting their health, or their behaviors are impacting their heart health, or their metabolism, or their ability to stand, because a lot of people get dizzy if they're not eating. So if they can't physically show up for the session, then I'm going to say, like, I think you need to go and get some treatment, some medical treatment, and do some refeeding and some like normalization of your behaviors. And then we can work on what are the underlying causes of that. And eating disorders and disordered behaviors can be thought very differently in the terms of a relationship, which is that they show up as like a huge shame about the body, a feeling of not good enough, and a desire to control outcomes in a really deep way. Really similar to, it's kind of like OCD with food. So I need to ritualize my food. It needs to be perfect. And if it isn't, I'm not safe. I'm not okay. And underneath that, that is like a deep sense of like, I'm not safe in the world. So then we just start there and explore like, what's so scary about being in the world? And there's all these different voices that show up. There's like the eating disorder voice, and then there's the one that wants to recover. And then there's the one that doesn't want to recover, the one that doesn't want to deal with it at all, the one that's blaming everybody, the one that's super perfectionistic. So all of those voices and parts of a human show up if they've got an eating disorder. And the horses will, depending on which one's up, show you what it's like and teach you like, where is relationship in this? And in most of those cases, there is none. Someone who, if you can think about it, someone who has disordered eating or an eating disorder has no healthy relationship with themselves, except when they decide to get recovery. And even then, it's about, how do I fix myself? When what horses teach us is that there's nothing wrong with us. It's just, how do we become more whole? How do we own all of the different parts of who we are and make choices based on our awareness of that and our compassion for ourselves, rather than we have to get rid of this, because that might as well just be another diet, but like a personality diet. Like, here's the bad part. I'm just going to cut it out and take it and throw it away. And it's like, no, we need to, like, all of it matters. And you can't cut parts of yourself out. Although some people do try. So it rolls itself forward from like, I always take the approach, and I work a lot with folks who have addictions as well. So any kind of compulsive self-destructive behavior is a huge part of my practice. And it's like, how do we understand what need that's meeting? So as long as you're stable, right? And I ask people who are using substances to not show up to sessions high or under the influence, but I don't have any particular judgments about what they do outside of the sessions, because until they're ready to let that behavior go because they've got another source of meeting that need, they're not going to anyway. I mean, I worked in, alcohol and drug treatment for 5 years, and there's no way that anybody is going to get sober or stay sober if they haven't developed another way to meet the need that the substance was giving them, whatever that was, whether it was, comfort, relaxation, stimulation, alleviating boredom. They have to figure out another way to do that first before they can let go of that behavior. So we don't go straight to like, you have to stop using or you have to stop doing this stuff. It's basically, let's make sure that your life is not at risk. And then we start understanding what purpose the behavior is serving and go from there.
So you think there has to be a replacement that gives you the same level or close to the same level of enjoyment, for lack of a better word, or what you perceive as enjoyment before you can actually get rid of it?
Yeah, I think maybe it's best understood through the idea of like when we're kids, or think about like a need that's unmet, that's uncomfortable. Like if I have to pee and I can't pee, I'm uncomfortable. If I'm hungry and I can't eat, I'm uncomfortable. If I'm lonely and I have no one in my life, that's really uncomfortable. So most people, when they don't have their emotional needs met, they suffer from dysregulation, nervous system dysregulation. So either hyper arousal, so like anger, irritability, impatience, or hypo arousal, depression, hopelessness, and collapse. Those two states are something that happens when we don't have a need met. So think about like what happens if you're really hungry. People get hangry, or they get hyper aroused if they don't have that need met. So now translate that to emotional needs for comfort, validation, understanding, soothing, touch, which we all need. Then when those things don't get met on a regular basis, which everybody who's got some kind of addiction or some kind of self-destructive pattern inevitably has childhood trauma. And the childhood trauma can be as simple as, my parents were the cry it out parents rather than the pick me up parents. And how that impacts each individual is going to show up in their nervous system. So what a substance does is it mimics the relief of getting a need met. Because when we get our needs met, like I have to pee, all of a sudden I pee, it feels amazing, right? If I'm starving and I finally get a meal, it's the most amazing meal I've ever had. So what I'm really looking for in my life is relief from the discomfort of an unmet need. And substances are really good at providing relief because they flood your brain with good stuff, right? Dopamine at the very least. depending on what your substance of choice is, relaxation with alcohol, stimulation with stimulants. So it's like, whew, like I just get that sense of relief. And that's what most people are. Same thing with OCD, right? You do a ritual, you get the relief. Same thing with an eating disorder. You go through your binge purge cycle, you get relief. Same thing with self-harm. You flood your body with all of the endorphins that happen when you create a wound on your body. So all of those things are providing you with a relief, but it's a superficial, temporary sense of relief in your nervous system rather than actually meeting the need. So there's not really, my having to go pee thing doesn't work here anymore, but it's like, I get the sense of like, without actually peeing. But I basically just don't feel my bladder anymore. And substances blot us out from our unmet emotional needs, right? We don't feel the pain of loneliness or discomfort or sadness or unworthiness when we're high or when we're drunk or when we're, in the aftermath of doing a cycle. So it distracts us from it and takes care of it. So until we can figure out some ways, this is why a lot of addictions research and addictions recovery is based on coping strategies. And I would say equine therapy helps us to take coping strategies to the next level, which is we're actually going to learn how to meet that emotional need. So if it's comfort, touch, connection, which it is most of the time, horses provide those things. You can go and like groom for an hour and your body just goes like, oh. Like I've got some teen clients that really go to self-harm when they're struggling. They struggle with depression and anxiety, and they come and I can stand there for 45 minutes with them, and they will groom the horse for 45 minutes. And then when they leave, they're like back in their eyes. They can talk and have conversations. They can say what was going on. As we walk back to their car, they're telling me all about their week. Meanwhile, an hour ago, I was like, so what's going on? And they're like, oh, no, nothing. I'm fine. Right. So it gets them back into like, they're back here. So then we teach them how to do that for themselves. Like, what does it mean to get that kind of connection through your own ability to connect with yourself? And that means working through all of the ways that we buy into our stories of unworthiness, negative self-talk, the ways that we like create self-sabotage patterns in our lives. And all of those contribute to meeting the underlying need of connection, comfort, touch, worthiness, whatever it might be. And then as we build that up, there is absolutely no need for those behaviors anymore. So it turns into like, well, I don't have to go pee, so I don't have to like blot out my bladder anymore. And their nervous systems are adjusted. So that was my experience with the Qigong for me, but everybody that I've worked with in addictions, that's not an easy task. Like, hey, let's just learn how to help you to connect. But there's a lot of ways that we can learn that from the horses. They teach us how to connect and just being with them. So people come and get their, weekly dose of connection, and then that helps them. And then they practice it and they bring back the memories of the horses at first. They might sit and just imagine a horse being with them, and that really helps to calm them down. So that does a lot more than, distracting yourself or doing other things that tend to be more of the coping side of things.
So you've alluded to this, but how does it actually work? Mm-hmm. Meaning you've said someone might just come and groom the horse for 45 minutes and that just brings them back to centers you, right? Mm-hmm. Or it pulls you out of that downward spiral, whatever that necessarily thing is, or wherever those people are. That's right. So someone comes, they get out of the car and you just, you talk to the horse. I mean, how does that work?
Great. So it depends on what they're showing up with. It can be as simple as what I just described. And that is simple. I'm not saying easy, and I'm not saying not like complicated in a deeper way, but to just go and spend time with an animal and have your entire nervous system reset is pretty cool. So for some people, that is the beginning of their process of just realizing I can feel differently. From there, what we do, depending on what they're showing up with again, it can get as complex as having someone who has high levels of self-awareness, a lot of emotional fluency, who are able to identify what's going on inside of them and name what's going on, and are open to feedback. And a session can look like we walk out into the herd, or there's horses, we go into their space, the horses respond, something happens, and my job is to ask questions that are basically what and how questions. So like, what's going on for you? What was that like when the horse did X, Y, or Z? How did that feel? how does this relate to your life, right? So let's just say those might be 4 anchor questions that I could ask in multiple different ways throughout a session that bring up someone's self-awareness. And as they are more grounded with the horses, or they're more in their bodies with the horses, they're going to be more likely to see what it is that's going on. So I have some adult clients who show up, and what they're working on is something like, I have a wound that is an attachment wound around I didn't get my needs met and I had to become really self-sufficient. And when the horse walks away from me, because I'm showing up self-sufficient, I'm good. The horse walks away. They're like, oh, well, that's fine. You're like, well, what was that like for you? Whatever, you can go eat. It's not a big deal. And we can take a session. I talk about accordions, like accordion that moment out and just say like, well, what happened in your body? And then they might look into their bodies and go, well, I felt like my stomach got tight. Interesting. Let's try again. And we walk towards the horse walks away or doesn't, whatever happens. Let's track this thing in your belly and see what happens with that. And then if it stays or intensifies or it goes away, then we track like, well, what was going on? What did it have to say? What was your thought process? What happened for you? And inevitably people are going to say like, oh, well, my brain told me I didn't take it personally when he walked away, but my stomach thought it did. And what my stomach was saying is that I wasn't good enough. Okay, what's it like? How does that show up in your life? Like, well, I tend to always be the one that withdraws from relationships before someone has a chance to hurt me, or I like don't take anything on, everything's fine, I'm really easygoing and flexible. It's like, well, what about this need to feel worthy? What happens to that? And then we name that, walk up to the horses. Inevitably, the horses are going to walk towards someone because they're more congruent. And then they get the connection. And then it's like, what's it like to get to the connection? And then they go, oh, well, my stomach pain went away, and they connect. Great. So where do you get connection like this in your life? Well, I don't. Let's talk about that. What gets in the way of you being able to accept connection in your life? And then it's like, well, let's examine all the patterns. Or the connection happens with the horse, and then the stomach pain gets worse. And it's like, oh, what's that about? We take some time and breathe and ask the questions. And what comes out is, now that I've got it, I'm terrified of losing it. And I don't know how to keep it. And I feel like I need to offer the horse something, or I feel like I'm just standing here in terror that he's going to walk away. And then the horse walks away and it's like, whew, your worst nightmare just happened. Now how do you feel? So all of this stuff can happen just with horses walking up and walking away with someone who has a relatively moderate to high amount of self-awareness. And they can see all of the ways that this relates to their lives when we slow it down. And I'm like, well, who do you feel like this is in your life? Like, who is the horse? Like, we know the horse is the horse today, but whose connection are you scared of losing? Or whose connection were you scared of losing in your past? And then they're able to say, it was my dad, or it was my mom, or whatever it was, or it was, friends in middle school, whatever their own story is, it's going to show up. And then they get to acknowledge it. There's usually some emotion that shows up when they land on something. Most people, you can see it, whether they cry or not, or whether something happens, you can see the wave go through their faces. And that's usually when horses will walk up and eat at their feet, or they'll chew, or they'll all come and stand around. So when someone's into their like wounding and really naming it and tolerating the pain of that thing that has been driving their patterns, horses show up and offer comfort. And then it's okay to feel it. It's not so scary, because as humans, we avoid those core wounds because they're terrifying to feel them on our own. And so we don't. We pattern them away. We strategize them away, right? Like we become our personalities to not have to face those wounding, so that when they do show up and we've got company, like big company and soft, gentle, snuffly, comforting company, then it can heal. Like it shows up, it comes up, and it's got somewhere to go, and you've got company, and you've got somewhere to give it to, and someone to help you hold it. And then it can like digest and leave you. So people can experience intense transformation through just like that. That could have been a 45-minute session. Pretty easy. That could have been 5 sessions, right? Depending on someone's pacing. But by that end, they're going to come back and be like, I felt different. I felt different in my marriage. I felt different at work. I felt different with my friends, whatever it was. And something shifted for me. And I just don't have that same like gut wrenching fear around things. So I shared something with somebody, or I, went out and felt relaxed for the first time, or whatever it was, right? But inevitably, if your nervous system has digested a wound and it's no longer scary to feel, then goes through you, and there's space for new experiences. And that's the transformation. It's transformation. It's not deeper understanding. It's not like, oh, I get it now. It's like, I am different. My physiology is different after working with horses like that. And for some people,
you're really using the horses like that. Oh, go ahead.
No. That was it. It's like, and for some people, it's just grooming for like 50 sessions. Right? It really just depends on the person. Yeah.
But you're using the horse as the truth serum, because you're probably watching the horse more than you're watching the person, because you know that, because you're in touch with the horse. And I always, Allison, I always wonder, like, sometimes people have animals and sometimes even dogs. We're talking about horses, but I'm like, don't you see what your animal is doing? Like, are you in touch with that?
Yeah.
And some people are just oblivious to that. I'm like, like telling you something, and you can meet someone, you can actually figure out more about them by watching their dog than you can by actually listening to them, is what I found. But you have to be in touch with that.
Yeah.
So as I'm listening to you, I'm like, wow, it seems like a better mode of being a therapist, because, well, for everybody, right? Because you're able to actually concentrate on some other things, because the horse is actually telling you the truth to figure out if they're telling you the truth. And that's how this essentially, I say truth. I don't mean truth as in like absolute, but have they gotten there yet? Because if the horse walks away, there's obviously not something jiving, right? Because the horse would want to stay because they're a pack animal.
Yes, you got it. Like, I'm definitely tracking the horse, so I know when to say what just happened there. If the horse is doing something, or the horses are doing something that I know is behavior that is marking, underlining or circling something that's going on for the client, then I can be the one who does the well-placed question, like, I just know, and I don't interpret what's going on with the horse. I'll just say like, oh, I just noticed he put his head down, or he rubbed his nose, or he walked away. What was going on for you in that moment? And so I know when to ask the question that's going to help them understand what's going on for themselves, which means that I'm taking myself out of like the expert analyzer position, which I think a lot of people think, like when people find out I'm a therapist, depending on their relationship with their own world or whatever it is, or their history, they're like, oh, you're like a head shrinker, you're going to analyze me, or you're watching everything I do. And I'm like, I mean, no, because I'm not being paid. But it's like I'm no longer in that position, right? I am no longer that person who is giving the feedback and saying like, oh, I think this is what's going on for you. Instead, I'm watching the horse and saying, something's going on for you because of what the horse is doing. And you get to tell me what that is on your own terms. I don't have to be the one that's like going to pull it out of you. And a lot of people do their own work inside. Like, they will come to me. I might let someone wander off and go and have their own interaction with the horses. And then I check in with them 10 minutes later. I'm like, how's it going? How'd that go? I saw some stuff happen. Tell me about it. And they come to me and they're like, well, I came to this ultimate conclusion and I had a huge transformation. And I'm like, great, you did it all on your own. So it's ideal because it takes the power dynamic out of it. I'm not the one who's the expert about you. You're the expert about you. And the horses are the ones who are showing you the way. And because they are truthful and trustworthy, then people really lean into that a lot more, and they start to crave it. They're like, I really want that authentic feedback where I don't feel judged, where I don't feel like someone's analyzing me or telling me that I'm sick or broken or whatever. And I get to like really learn a lot about myself from my dog squeaking. Oh, take it outside. Take it. I know you're excited. Go. But yeah, same thing, right? Like
well, he's definitely telling us that you ignored him today. But go ahead.
Yeah, he was. Well, my husband just got home, so he's excited about him too. So, but yeah, I know our horses really well, and so I know their behaviors. Like, I know my big guy, that when he's rubbing his ears, that he's anxious, something doesn't feel settled for him. For another guy, he's going to be the one who's going to show you his butt. The other one's just going to walk away. So they all have their ways of communicating both the like calm, relaxed response, and the like incongruent, you don't feel right to me, I'm going to try and show you that response.
You alluded to this, but it was a question: is eventually do people figure out what's really going on and are able to just show up and go hang out with the horse, and you because they actually get in tune and I'm like that person you said just had a transformation without you, because
Mm-hmm.
they eventually figure if they're paying attention. I mean, I imagine it could happen in one session or it could happen in 50, right? But um, they eventually start to figure out what's really going on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, if they keep showing up, then it's inevitable. Part of my job, before and after kind of bookending on sessions is, providing them with psychoed around what they can do to increase their awareness. And depending on the level of trauma that they've got and depending on what their motives are coming into sessions, um, some people really want to be self-aware and other people really struggle with it because if they have a lot of trauma, they have a lot of wounding, self-awareness is terrifying because it's everything that I might have now at this time in my life. I find something out about myself and I'm like, oh my God, that's such good information. Wow, cool. I get to grow and I'm excited about it. And so, and like the other last week when my horse did the thing that I told you about, I was like, that's awesome. Such good information about this piece inside of me that I show up when I want to go and spend time with him. And for someone else to see that or feel that, if they have a lot of trauma, their initial response is always going to be shame. Like, what's wrong with me? I can't believe that that's what I do. Oh my God, I'm a horrible person. Or I need to hide it or, find a way to put it away. So a big part of the process is learning how to relate to ourselves differently. And that is a big part of my job, is helping to facilitate teaching people how to be, kinder, more validating, more compassionate towards themselves. And then the horses help support that too, because I did a session with a woman at the very beginning of my career. It wasn't even a session. I think she just came for an experience. And she had really intense, high self awareness, but incredible self criticism. So that's a horrible combination, right? Like, I know exactly what all my shit is, and I hate myself for it. And that was her pain that she really had to deal with. And she came for a session with horses, and all of her stuff was up. The horse walked away. All of her stuff was up. The horse walked away. She's like, I really want to connect, but I feel bad for wanting to connect. Like, it was just really intense. And then I said, well, just try this. Just try like naming it and feeling it in your body, all of it. And you have the intention to not judge it. Just say, like, this is what it is right now. I'm not going to try and change anything. And as soon as she just said, okay, and she shifted to that, like, this is who I am. This is what it is. From across the arena, the horse turned around and walked and put his head over her shoulder. So it's like, they don't need us to be perfect, but what they really love is when we stop judging ourselves. And they connect with us when we stop judging ourselves. Because the truth is that when we're in self-judgment, we are not available for connection because we're not connected with ourselves. So we can't really relate when we're in a place of, self-judgment. We have to be open-hearted to our partner or to our friend or whatever. And if we're not open-hearted to ourselves, it makes it really hard for us to open up to the vulnerability and risk and, intimacy that's involved in real relationships. So if we can't even do that with ourselves, it's going to be hard for us to show up with others. And when we drop that imperfect, flawed, messy, stuck, whatever, but we drop that judgment, the horses are like, finally, you're here. And that's what they want. So that's usually a huge layer that can take a really long time before we even get to the stuff, before we get to that place that I described in that session of like my desire for connection or my fear around losing it or whatever it is. We might have to spend a really long time just learning how available am I when I'm in self-judgment and how to hold that. How do I not judge my self-judgment? How do I not judge my judgment of my self-judgment? How do I just hold this mindful space? Which horses are really good at teaching because they're present all the time. So it's like I can be aware and just hold all of that while I'm standing with a horse in a pasture. And if I have that skill, then I can be a lot more compassionate when my stuff does show up. And then I am way more available for the transformation. So everybody gets there. But if that's like a huge, huge part of the work, then we've got to spend time on that too. It's kind of like the meta process before we get to the actual work. And for some people, if they have really complex PTSD, If they have like really deep traumatic injury that involves relationship, then that can just be what we work on. And we don't always necessarily get to the big transformative pieces. Sometimes the transformation is I learned to stop judging myself. And that's my big lesson for the whatever year that I work with. Because for some people, that's really, really hard. So that's how individual it is. But most people have enough experiences with the horses that they can take it with them, which is what I want. I want to work myself out of a job so that I could just be there in the pasture and make sure that nothing's going to happen safety wise and people can go and get what they need. Some of the veterans groups that I work with, I do a weekly group at Allegiance Ranch in Erie, and there's at least 4 or 5 people who show up regularly, and I'm just there. They all go find their horse, find their space, find what they want to do. They know what to do. And for an hour and a half, they just go do what they need to do. And then I'm like, did you get what you need? And they're like, absolutely. And that's as much as we talk. So the therapy doesn't have to be like the therapy. It can just be them understanding how to get what they need with the horses. And they all do. It's pretty cool.
Is this therapy for anyone? I mean, I mean, we've talked about, and we can talk about, because I'm interested in the PTSD, and I heard a story recently of how maybe you with somebody, a veteran, had this transformation through a horse, and another friend told me and couldn't believe it. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I totally believe it. I grew up with horses. Like you clearly haven't been around a horse. Like it's hard to explain
Yeah.
really. And it is different than a dog. At first, when you said that earlier in our conversation, I was like, I don't know, Allison. I don't know, but probably, but there is a different. Dogs think, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and horses don't think as much. They do react. So I do agree with you there. Not that it really matters that I agree, but I'm just like having my own self-reflection to figure out if I actually am in touch with the hell's going on. But um I mean, there's addictions, there's relationship therapy. Like, does this work for relationships? Do couples come to this?
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, I do couples work. I mean, the main part of my private practice, I mean, I have 2 parts of my job, but my private practice, I focus mostly on tweens and teens that are struggling with some kind of self-destructive behavior, anxiety, depression, and I work with their entire family. So a big part is like, if you want to work with me, then the whole family's got to come at least for a couple sessions. So everybody can experience the same thing, the same like what's different when we are breathing, slowing down, hanging out together, and connecting together like our own little mini herd in the big herd, having positive experiences of connection together. And what are the things that might get in the way of that? And then we unpack like, what's the pattern? Dad's really busy and he compartmentalizes, so he doesn't have a whole lot of like emotional availability. And so the kid feels like lonely and sad, and like dad's not available, and mom's really anxious and overwhelmed, and so she's got lots of stuff going on, and so she's never really calm. So when she's available, she's always trying to fix everything, and that doesn't feel good to the kid. All of that stuff is going to show up when you're grooming a horse with a family, and it might take a few sessions to get there. But it's really, really powerful because it just shows up and they all see it and they feel it and they can name it. And then the horses move in and then they get connection with the horses. The mini donkeys tend to be really good with family work for whatever reason. And I've done tons of couples work. So that's a little bit more complicated, but or maybe just different. Couples work is always more complicated, I think, or that might just be my bias. But um, couples will learn what it takes to be present with your partner, which is what we want from our partners. And if they're in conflict, there's a lot of things that get in the way of that. So they get to practice it with the horse, and then they see like, what's different with my human? Oh, turns out a lot. Places where I maybe don't trust them, places where I don't feel safe with them. And then what do I need in order to feel safe? And that's going to come from the body. So it's like, well, what helps you to feel safe with the horse? What feels different from the horse versus with your partner? And then we start at the most basic level. Like most couples therapy is, let's work on identifying patterns and change in communication. This is like, let's go underneath that and go to like, how do you feel with each other? Do you feel safe? Why or why not? And then you're going to be able to start changing your communication, because mean, you can learn nonviolent communication till the cows come home, but if you're saying it with like a dysregulated nervous system, it's not going to land. So it has to start from like tone, breath, eye contact, all the things that tell us that our partner is available. And if you can't do that with the horse, then we work with that. If you can't do it with your partner, but you can with the horse, then we learn about that. So it's pretty cool. It's a lot of work. Like it's a lot of really deep work, but it works great for couples and for families, at least in my practice. And then the other piece that we work on at Medicine Horse, where I do the groups, is that the groups themselves are like a little mini herd where we create safety. So like the veteran that you're talking about, the big power wasn't necessarily just the horses, although they had a huge part in it. The other power was the group itself, the veterans showing up and taking risks with the horses, trying new things with the horses. So everybody was at the same level of, let's learn about the horses and go and have the same experiences with them. And then let's learn from each other's experiences. And, I create a really specific container for the groups so that it's emotionally safe, so that connection is highlighted, so that people have specific types of conversations. And so there's a specific kind of connection that happens. And when that happens, then the horses can take over and then the veterans take over. They connect with each other. They connect with the horses. And there's this like sweet veteran herd and horse herd that all mixes up that gave this particular veteran, but lots of other veterans, permission to change their behavior. Like we've had probably 2 or 3 veterans who said like, I leave the house now. And it started with every Friday morning I come to group. And then I found out that I can call people and I can ask them to go for lunch with me after the group. And then I can find out that actually leaving the house isn't so scary and so bad. In her particular case, it was like, I have the courage and I have the skills and the willingness now to face how my experience overseas impacted me. And I can feel those feelings in a safe environment. And I can process that. And then I can move on. But without the safety of the group and without any kind of modeling around that or any like anchoring with the horses, then that would feel really scary, which it did for her for a long time. So at least she's probably the most recent, but I would say, we've had lots of veterans have similar experiences where it's all of a sudden like they've decreased their substance use, or they've like stood up to their ex-wives, or they've spent more time with their kids, or we had one veteran who's like, yeah, I had the courage to go and get a diagnosis of adult autism, and it actually really helped to explain a lot of what was going on. And now I'm functioning and I'm doing a lot better and things are, incredibly better. The most recent one was a couple. The man was a Vietnam vet and he was exposed to Agent Orange and so had multiple cancers from the beginning of the 90s and had just been in cancer treatment for like 30 years. Just a lot. And his wife was his caregiver, and the VA had, 100% disability. So she was financially supported. That was her full-time job. And they came to us to do a caregivers group that was meant to support the caregivers. And it gave her permission to go and get some of her own support and get more resource so that she could show up and support him. And then he got to go and have an experience without her, which showed him that he could do more than he thought. And it also gave her permission to not feel like she needed to take care of him all the time. And they would come back and they'd say, well, we knew that it was time for group because we had group on Thursday. And then by like Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, we started to get cranky again and we knew we needed to go back to the barn. And then, they'd go and have that same experience, but then their relationship transformed. It went from one that was like high conflict and avoidance to one there was a lot more care and compassion. And he had a wheelchair and the horses got used to it, and he would just go and zoom out into the pasture and spend time with the horses. And he was just quiet, and he died in February. And his wife said that, the last year and a half of his life coming to the barn was priceless for him. He had a place of peace, is what he called it. So, and she had a chance to have a break, and she's still in connection, and she's come to some of our other groups. And so we kind of take the model of the horse herd and we want to expand it to the human herd to get that same support for everybody. And so it's not just the individual stuff, it's the groups too. Pretty cool.
Is your success rate higher, do you think, with the horse approach than it would be individually?
Mm-hmm. I think so, for sure. We do pre and post surveys. I know your question was like, is this for everybody? But I want to answer that quickly. But we do pre and post surveys, and like the numbers are ridiculous, right? Like it's like 100% of the respondents had at least 25% increase in well-being or quality of life or hope or sense of being connected. Everybody who comes is like, yes, this is amazing. We don't get any negative feedback for the groups. This is testament to some of I get referred by people that I don't even know. So they'll be like, oh, I'm calling for my kid. Lauren referred me. Somebody referred me. And I'm like, I don't know who that is. And if I backtrack it, it's usually someone who knows somebody that I treated a couple years ago. And so I'm like on their radar. And 2 years later, they still remember the effectiveness of the treatment. Like I had a girl who is adopted. She's 12, and her father came and brought her to sessions. And he said, oh, yeah, so-and-so referred you. And I had to think about it. I'm like, the name seems familiar. And I thought about it, and I was like, oh, my God. I treated her when I was in my internship 7 years ago, and you're dating her. And he said, I want to thank you because she is so good at being in relationship. And I haven't ever met anybody who's like her. And she says it's because of the work that you did. And she recommends you above and beyond everybody else. So I don't have to market myself. I haven't changed my website in 6 years. It's like people just show up. And it's because I'm doing, first of all, as you heard my story, the work that is fully aligned with my value system and completely and totally an expression of who I am and what matters to me. So I'm all in, but it's also like an intensely powerful modality. Who it's not for is people who are not ready to do the work, who are not ready to like do work. So, and there are people who are like that. They really do better in and do really well in therapy where there's a lot of listening, validating, talking, a place to put your stuff down, kind of like what I had when I was a teen, someone to talk to, but nobody who's going to challenge you or ask you to take steps towards doing something different. Because if you don't do something different with horses, you're always going to get the same response. They're always going to walk away or they're always going to whatever. They're always going to stand there and just not connect with you. So there's always a call to change in equine therapy, and not everybody is ready for that. Not everybody is ready to face the possibility or the risk or the courage that's needed in order to change from the inside out. Some people really are looking for comfort and validation and someone who can naturalize what their experience is, and other people are not ready to change, and that's okay. I have no judgments with those people, but they generally don't do well in equine therapy because the horses are like, well, see ya. So, and honestly, I have met some people who are really high verbal processors, and they just need some psycho ed and need to understand what's going on. They don't, and that's all they need. And equine therapy would be like kind of like a moot point. They don't need the experience; they just need the information. And those folks do really well with someone who's like, yeah, here, let me just explain the nervous system to you. And they're like, great, thank you. 5 sessions later, and I'm good. So I would say those are some outliers, but they would definitely be the folks who would not do well. So.
Oh, I had a medicine horse. Can you talk a little bit about that? And it's a nonprofit. You work for them. It's how I actually met you, through a friend. And I had seen some equine therapy. I heard about it. I think that I grew up in horse country in Maryland, and I think inherently everyone there knows that the horses heal. So it's just like part of, and horse people are a little weird. And I say that lovingly because I grew up in horse country, and they are. I'm sorry. Like it's their herd is the people. And if you're not used to that, it's weird coming into that environment. And it's hard to explain that to people, but I think that, and a lot of the people in that community, I would say this, I was going to say this earlier. I think, Allison, I don't say most people are broken, but everyone's got a sad story and something that they need to fix. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, sometimes I get tired of hearing it because everyone's selling their sad story online now in some way. It's like, don't lead with your sad story. If you want to hear a sad story, I'll tell you a sad story about myself. Like, it's not really sad. I don't mean sad, Allison. We all have things that hold us back in some way, right or wrong. They affect us, and we need to get through them, or through them, around them, whatever you want to call it, to become that allows us to become a better version of ourselves.
Yes.
In that way. So I think everybody has that. As I'm sitting here thinking, I was like, I'm not naming any names. I was like, hey, did you actually talk to that person who we met with? Like, maybe they could use this. Like, this could transform them in some way. But my question, I don't even know what my question was, but going off around horse people, it's like bringing me back to that part that even when we used to do riding lessons, it was like no one was really ever angry. If you sort of look back on that, I mean, my pony would take off like a bat out of hell, and I'd sometimes fall off. But
Yeah.
in general, people were generally happy around horses.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah. I
we're
don't know where I was
outside
going with
with
that. I think I
them.
was. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
we're outside, and um, one of my horse resources. If you spend a lot of time in the horse community, especially around Boulder, you're going to get woo woo pretty fast. But we talked about the horse human agreement that has been we've co-evolved for millennia. Horses have been a part of our lives for a really long time, and they have served purposes that have allowed us to become civilized. And when I even just think about my horse as a Clydesdale, who, when I did some research on the breed, it was like, yeah, he was basically, his ancestors were tractors in Scotland, and did all of the really heavy duty work and were the size of elephants. I mean, they're big horses, and basically allowed that to happen. And we have been partnering with them forever. And only in the last 100 years, let's say, has that relationship changed since, the engine has come in. They don't have jobs anymore. So what purpose do they serve for us? And there's a lot of folks in my field who are like, they're part of our lives still because they have this really special gift. One of my friends, I was talking about this interview, and she said, well, do you think horses are magical? And I said, I don't think they're magical. I just think they're better than we are. And she was like, well, what do you mean? And we had a little conversation about it. And it was like, they help us to be more aware of the places where we need to grow because of how authentic and present they are. And that those are the things we need from each other. So they're serving this cool spiritual role for us now, which is to teach us how to grow. And everybody who's been around horses gets it. Nobody asks why horses when they've been around them, because they know what it's like. That's why people drive around with these bumper stickers that says, my horse is my therapist, or I don't need therapy, I just need to go to the barn, or whatever it is. I don't know how many how many bumper stickers you've seen on pickup trucks around where you are, but that's definitely a thing here. And it's true. And it's like, well, duh, we're outside. We're connecting with nature. We're communing with other beings that we've domesticated. They're a part of our lives and have been. We're partnering with them. We're in relationship. That's where humans are meant to be. We're not meant to be like in front of screens, calculating, spending all this time up in our heads and trying to maximize profits and doing whatever we're doing. Not that that's a bad thing, but when there's no balance, it really does impact our mental and emotional health. And it's necessary in order to survive. And if that's all we're thinking about and doing all the time, we've lost an essential part of who we are, which is this relational being, connecting part. And like connection for no reason other than just connection, I would say that that's probably what they've taught me, that connection is itself an end, and it doesn't have to like get me anywhere. In fact, if it's trying to get me anywhere, it's probably not connection. So it's like, what a radical concept for us, where we maximize and engineer our lives in order to, optimize and do all of those things, which is, again, not a bad thing. But what are we losing something where we just get to be ourselves and be messy and rest and take breaks and like putz around the barn, and watch our horse eat grass for a bit. I would say that's probably what 90% of the folks who show up are really especially in groups. We do a group with women with breast cancer, and oh my God, an hour and a half to 2 hours of them not having to do anything for anybody else is revolutionary, because they're always doing something for somebody else. And when they just get to sit around and not do anything and just pet a horse, it's like, they change their lives. They go home and they say, that's it. I'm not going to do any laundry on Sundays or whatever it is. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, the question I had before, Allison, was medicine horse.
Oh, right.
Getting around. What? Yeah, like, and so it's a nonprofit that brings in groups. What type of groups? And I don't know how I went off on horse country. I just talking about horse. I mean, we have a horse. It's actually in Maryland, so I don't have the horse here. And we have a lot of horses. Believe it or not, we live in Half Moon Bay, California, which is 7 miles to maybe 23 minutes, 27 minutes to SFO. But we have people who ride horses to the restaurant here. So we have horses everywhere. But medicine horse, can you talk just a little bit about that and the work you do and people who may be interested? I imagine you are in Boulder for listeners out there if you didn't catch that, but you don't have to be in Boulder. I mean, do you have people who come in for like groups? I don't know. So maybe you could explain a little bit about your work there.
Yeah, for sure. So equine therapy is expensive. In order to, I mean, pretty much everybody I know who does equine therapy either has some kind of like secret free barn and, horses that people have lent to them, or they have partners who make a lot of money and who can afford the property for it, or whatever. So it's, in order to just even set up an equine therapy practice, you need to have land and you need to have horses and you need to take care of them. And that's a huge amount of investment. So that means that the hourly rates tend to be higher than traditional office or online therapy. So it can be really inaccessible for people. And, where I come from, and I really truly believe that mental health care is healthcare, and that there should be access. And so in Boulder, where lots of people can afford individual and paid sessions, we want to make sure that there's also groups that who can't afford it or who might not necessarily get equine therapy who have access to it. So nonprofit, we're funded donations, grants, and we've chosen some populations on purpose. And most of the populations, we don't want to do a diagnosis-based population, so like a depression group or an anxiety group or something like that. Instead, we want to focus on groups that have common identities. So I mentioned a few of them. Veterans is a big one. We started with those groups a few years ago, and they've been really successful. And then we do a group called Wholeness with Horses, which is for women who are going through breast cancer treatment. And again, so they have something in common. And those folks tend to be like, both of those groups tend to feel really isolated and alone. And that the support that they get through traditional means doesn't feel good to them for whatever reason. Lots of women report that going to a breast cancer support group is really depressing and really overwhelming and makes them feel really hopeless, because they're either hearing about someone who has a much worse diagnosis than they do, or all they're hearing is about everybody bitching about the doctors and the nurses and how things are really horrible and nobody's listening to them. And that just feels heavy. So both of those groups have like a need for a different kind of support. We're doing and expanding our LGBTQ teen groups. It's called the Rainbow Wranglers. It's fantastic. Casey, who runs these groups, is just amazing. And she's got like such a pulse on what this community needs. And in Boulder, there's a lot of young kids, tweens and teens who are struggling with how do they feel part of the community. And there's a lot of generational stuff with parents and grandparents about how do we know, and like, do we accept this, and how to use pronouns, and a lot of struggles, but also that these kids just really need to know that they can be safe, and they can be safe with each other in these groups. So that's really big. And then we're starting to expand into serving the Latino and Latinx community, mostly recently arrived or first generation immigrants, some of them undocumented, who are dealing with the trauma of immigration, the trauma of like integrating into a very white part of the country, language barriers. And we serve the entire family, because for most of those folks in that community, the whole family is the whole family. Like, one person just doesn't go to therapy, everybody's going to therapy, and everybody wants to support. So we're developing programming to meet their needs the way that they want to have their needs met, rather than what we think they should be doing to get their needs met. And a lot of them have histories of living on ranches or being in an agricultural setting, mostly back in Mexico. And so they really love reconnecting with the animals. They've got lots of stories about what they experienced when they were kids, and then they want their kids to be outside and not on screens. And so there's a whole lot of like a really big need for connection and helping with that community. And then we also work with a lot of partner agencies. So we work with women who are on probation and look like trying to get through that process of being able to get back into their lives. We work a lot with teens. So we're doing like a teen recovery group. We do some adult recovery groups. So recovery meaning like substance use stuff. We work with an agency called Together that serves youth that are experiencing homelessness and transition. We did a great group this year with a school that serves kids who have like really high needs learning disabilities. So we're trying to find like the folks who are going through something similar and who need a place where they can talk about that and know that they're going to be understood and that they have somewhere to put it down and some connection to be had from it. Because if you think about, so the women with breast cancer, for example, they come and for the first 45 minutes, we do like what a normal support group would look like. Everyone checks in about their treatment, what's going on, what's been frustrating. They get lots of validation and lots of support. They get other people giving them resources. And then we move into the horses and we go and they get to regulate. We teach them about nervous system regulation and how that contributes to their experience of their symptoms. We help them to understand like what self-care might look like for them on an emotional level. And then they just go put their stuff down and they have fun with the horses. And then at the end, it's like, oh yeah, we came with all these problems and now they just don't seem so heavy. So support is very different. Support isn't just sharing and validation. Support is sharing validation and putting your stuff down and finding relief, that relief I was talking about through connection. And then the needs met for connection. And it's coming from a really big, furry, fun source. So all of those groups in one way or another need that sharing and that validation of common experience. And then they also need a place to put it down because it's just too much. Like the experiences of all of these groups are too much for us, right? If you think about what veterans have been through, that's too much. That's a lot. Good luck. Me as an individual trying to hold that and understand that. I need support. We need something bigger than us as humans to hold the pain and the struggle that everybody's going through who's in these groups. And they also need each other. So we, like I said, we were doing those things. The human herd and then supported by the horse herd and they get the connection. And then, like one woman who came to the breast cancer group quit her job. She was in a corporate job and she's like, that's it. I'm quitting. Life's too short. And she's like, I want to buy a horse and move to the mountains. Pretty sure she did. So it can be like a pretty big deal for some people to do that, as well as those veteran stories. The kids who come to the Rainbow Wranglers, they want to come back group after group. And they like really love being with each other. And that's really sweet. So, and then as we grow into the Latino community, they like don't want to leave. None of the kids want to leave. It's really sweet. So that's our big work. And that means we have to pay for the hay because horses eat a lot of it. We have to pay for the land. We don't own the property that we're on. And we need to continue to expand into these community partners that do pay for the groups. So we need to make sure that we're getting enough revenue and financial support to be able to offer all of those groups for free. So all of the groups that I named, 100% free. And that makes a really big difference. Pretty much everybody says, if this weren't free, I wouldn't have come. And I'm so glad I did. So we don't want to add extra burden onto anybody. We want it to be this very open thing. So 100% free. And we're looking to offer and open up a bunch of spots where we have a practice where interns are going to be offering services at low to no cost. And then continuing into like an externship where they do, where we take Medicaid and we offer folks who have Medicaid with interns. Because of course we wouldn't be able to pay a full price. Sorry, interns, but you guys come half price because you get hours. But it's like they'd be able to work with them and they get their hours as graduates. We'd be able to offer Medicaid funded equine therapy. So that's really our goal. Like, who are the people who need it? Let's make sure that we can get it to them for free. And in order to do that, we need lots of support. We just did a huge fundraiser. It went really well. So yeah, that's our model. And I'm the main clinical lead there, and we've got a great team and great horses and people who board their horses there for a discount, and they are really generous and let us work with their horses in therapy. So we've got a really, really cool community that we're starting to build with all the ups and downs that come with that. But we're hoping that what we offer in the group ripples out to how we treat each other in our work setting, and ripples out to volunteers, ripples out to everybody, so that we're really creating relationship and community with everybody, and that's the therapy, because that's what so many of us are missing with the horses as well.
How much is a normal, you said it was expensive. How much is a normal full cost session?
Probably between $180 and $200 for an hour. I charge a little bit less than that just because I want to keep it accessible as I can, and I have a sliding scale. But yeah, I mean, market when I started, for like someone who was doing full sessions and who had lots of experience, it was $150 10 years ago. So it's gone up since then. Yeah, and I would say some people are probably
Is
even
that
more.
for an hour?
Yeah, for an hour.
I'm just curious for listeners. I always, when you say expensive. So yeah, I mean, it is expensive, and what you're doing over there at Medicine Horse is really cool. Heard
Hmm.
good things about it. I do have a question. Have you proved with the science that the heart rate thing is real? That
Oh
when
yeah.
you're a horse, your heart rate actually go.
Mhm. Yeah, that's if you go to the heart math, I think it's heartmath.org or something like that. But if you just do heart math horses, if you Google that, they'll take you right to their webpage that talks all about it. It's the only like quotable science, because the rest of it is mostly anecdotal or qualitative research that talks about outcomes rather than anything that's measurable. So they had basically I just had heart rate monitors, and people would get closer to a horse, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, 2 feet, whatever it was, and they would measure their heart rate variability, and that was literally the experiment. And those results have been reproduced multiple times. So that's probably the solid, quote, science, that isn't the qualitative anecdotal outcome measured type of science. It's the like, we had this thing that we measured that changed based on how close we were to this animal. So yeah, that's for real. Even that alone, I'm like, that alone, that's all we need to
How's
know.
that?
They calm us down.
How's that work? How's that work?
I
Like,
mean,
how's that happen?
yeah, the theory is that, and this is where it stops being measurable, because the cause, it's correlative at this point rather than causal. But the theory is that, our hearts, everybody's heart, all the hearts of all beings, they have electric impulses that keep the heart beating. So that creates an electromagnetic field. And a heart that is in our body is whatever the size of our fist. But in a horse, especially a really big horse, it's probably going to be closer to the size of a football. So it has a much bigger electromagnetic field than ours do. So if I'm standing next to you, our fields probably aren't going to overlap. They're relatively small. We still have emotional impact on each other. If you're in a good mood, I'm probably going to catch your good mood. If I'm not feeling so great, you might get a little down. But when you're around a horse, the field is bigger, and so we can actually enter into their field. And that field has its own magnetic electro power that can influence ours. So it's something called entrainment, which is like a French word that just means like pulling. So their heart rate variability or their electromagnetic field actually pulls ours into their frequency and into their rhythm. So it has a physiological impact on our heart rate variability, which is like a full bodied thing, right? And that's the theory. I don't know if they've even they might have measured it. I haven't investigated it a whole lot, whether they actually measured the field, but I'm sure they could. I'm sure they could measure the field of it. And it's big enough that we can walk into it because our hearts are so big. Pretty cool.
Sort of opens up a lot of other questions about the universe, doesn't it, Allison?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what I learned from Qigong, was that we are energetic beings. Our energy is contagious, and our energy flows or doesn't based on how how aware we are, how grounded we are, how connected we are. And, it's an ancient Chinese theory, and yet it's palpable. I mean, I can feel someone's vibes. I'm probably a lot like a horse. I'm incredibly sensitive to what's going on with people, and I can read what's going on with someone and make really good guesses about what's happening, mostly just by reading their energy. And like you said, if you're paying attention, just like if I'm paying attention to my animals, I'm going to be able to see what it is that they're telling me. If you're paying attention to all beings, you're probably going to be able to pick up on what's going on with them. Um, Mostly what we do with our frontal cortexes is that we fill in blanks and we tell ourselves stories about what that means. And it's usually something about us when it's always something about the other person. But if we can set aside those stories and be really aware and present with what it is that we're sensing and we're taking in, then we get lots of information about the other person or the other being. And we know how to connect with them. It's pretty cool.
Well, I hope that you've gotten a very good vibe from this show, and and it's been fascinating. I am grateful for you taking your time to explain the horse magic. I think that's a great place to end. Where's the best place for people listening to find you and get in touch?
Well, my personal website for my private practice is horsesheal.net. I think if you just do it's like horses-heal.net, because I was cheap, so I didn't get a good one. And it was a long time ago. But that you can email me there. I'm on Psychology Today. So if you just search my name, if you just put Alison McCabe Boulder, I'll come up as a Psychology Today profile. And then I'm also on the Medicine Horse website. So you can just do medicinehorse.org or Medicine Horse Boulder and click through, and you'll find me on the staff page or whatever. And I think my email's in all three of those places, so you can contact me there. And I think I Googled myself a couple of years ago, and there's actually a woman in San Francisco whose name is Alison McCabe, who's also a therapist, but she lives in California. So yeah, you can probably just Google me and find me that way.
We'll put that all in the show notes. Allison, thanks for taking time. This has been awesome.
Yeah, it was super fun. Thanks for being curious and open to this pretty cool but hard to understand area of my world that I experience. So I appreciate your curiosity and your great questions. So thanks for inviting me on. I really had a good time.
Sure thing. Bye, everyone. Hold on one second. You can't leave yet.